So anyway, like I said, today I'm going to, of course, move on to talk about, like I said, the end of World War II. Of course, World War II, we're kind of up to like 1942. I'll kind of discuss how the war kind of changes. 1942, the Allies start winning. Of course, we'll kind of talk about the end of the war up to 1945, how the Allies pretty much defeat the Axis powers. If you have any comments, questions during the live stream, let me know, or you can always, of course, leave me comments later on my channel as well. So anyway, previously, going back to 1941, I had talked about how United States entered the war because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. I also talked about how the Soviet Union entered the war too when Hitler, invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. So obviously the war has changed a lot. I'll kind of get into, talking about the later stages of the war between 1942 to 1945. These are pretty much, the alliances that we have, by pretty much, 1942 right here. So on the Axis side, you've got Nazi Germany, Empire of Japan, of course, Kingdom of Italy, which are all kind of part of the tripartite pact I told you that formed in 1940. Then on the Allied side, you've got, of course, the Great Britain, the United States, Soviet Union. Don't forget the Republic of China also was in there too, as well, backed by especially the U.S. and the British, etc. So those are all your major powers that are really involved, pretty much in World War II. And obviously, the Allies had a better alliance system, better powers that were together. And of course, the United States had its industrial output that helped to defeat also the Axis powers as well. So I'll kind of talk about the turning point. Yeah, 1942 is considered to be the turning point year in World War II. That's because there were like 3 pivotal battles that were pretty important in World War II that I did want to talk about. These are the 3 ones. Of course, we'll talk about the Battle of El Alamein, which there were actually 2 first, second battles of El Alamein in 1942. That's the one at the top left in that picture. Battle of Stalingrad on the Eastern Front between 1942, ending in 43, actually in February. And then the Battle of Midway, you saw a little short video, of course. That was also considered another pivotal battle that was important, especially in the Pacific War. Of course, that happens, of course, later. So I will first talk about what happened really. I guess the one front we'll talk about is the North African front that occurs, of course, first. They have the North African front, which occurs between 1940 to 1943. This was an attempt by Hitler to take control of North Africa and then possibly seize Egypt. And if they took Egypt, the Nazis, they could then control like the Suez Canal, the oil fields, as well in the Middle East were very vital. And part of why Germany got involved in North Africa was because of the fact that the Italians were under Mussolini, were in Libya. They wanted to try to take over Egypt, but it failed. And so Hitler brought in forces to basically back Mussolini and take control of that part of the war. Here's kind of an expansion of this, but yeah, he brought in this general you see here named Erwin Rommel on the right, who, of course, they later referred to as being called the Desert Fox. He was called this because of the fact that he was known for being skilled at desert warfare, especially tank warfare in the deserts. And Rommel had gotten some military experience on the Western Front, fighting in France in World War II. And so he built up this German-Italian army that was mechanized, using tanks and trucks and things like that. And it was known as the Afrika Korps, usually spelled with a K, not a C. And so he was somewhat successful, taking control of Libya and then pushing into northern Egypt at one point. And he was opposed by the British, who controlled Egypt, which the British brought in this new general named Bernard Montgomery to fight against the German forces, who was known as Monty. They called him. And Monty was not the top British general in really on the British side of World War II, but it's the most famous, the most flamboyant overall. He was also pretty good with tank warfare as well, and he controlled the Eighth Army, the British Eighth Army that was basically controlling Egypt. Here's kind of a map, but they fought. They had two battles. They had the first El Alamein battle, which was in July, which was indecisive. But the second one, the second battle, El Alamein, that was considered to be really the most strategic battle that was fought in North Africa, fought between October to November of 1942. What happened was Rommel's forces tried to push eastward into northern Egypt. They wanted to seize control of El Alamein. When you see there's this small little city that's on the Mediterranean Sea there. El Alamein was important because of the fact that it was a Egyptian port city and vital railroad junction. And so if, Rommel could have taken that, he then could have marched on Cairo, taken Cairo, and then taken the Suez Canal, and then that would have been kind of a mess, after that. But what happened was the Germans were outnumbered, is what happened. The British had just more tanks and men than they had. I think Rommel had about 120,000 troops, and I want to say Montgomery's force had about 200,000, but they had way more tanks, like three times the amount of tanks and armored cars. And Rommel's forces were actually routed badly with heavy losses. I think 50,000 men captured also as well. And so it forced Rommel to retreat back into Libya. He gets pushed back into Libya, you see there, from there, and he'll eventually get pushed all the way back. I think at one point he gets pushed all the way into Tunisia and all of that later. And so that's going to be kind of important, in really what defeating the Germans, and of course in North Africa. So you have that going on at that point in 1942. And then they have Operation Torch that happened next, that followed, which began in November of that year. American forces under Dwight Eisenhower landed in North Africa, French North Africa, which was controlled by the Vichy French at that point, which is Morocco and Algeria. And you can see this task force landed there to take the cities of Casablanca, Oran, Algiers. And Operation Torch was, like I said, led by Eisenhower. Eisenhower, we'll get to him later, was the one that led D-Day, in June of 1944. Dwight Eisenhower was also president of the United States in the 1950s. They called him Ike, if you know about this. And he had several generals under him that were very famous, like George Patton. You may have heard of him. And Omar Bradley. Those are some of probably the best generals that really fought, I guess, in the Western European hemisphere and all that. But they are kind of violent. Operation Torch was pretty important because it set the stage for really Rommel's forces being pushed out of North Africa, and then they were going to use that to take over Italy afterwards. But Rommel's forces, they eventually would be surrounded in Tunisia by the spring of 1943, and they were forced to surrender a lot of their forces. Like about 300,000 were captured. Rommel left. Rommel escaped to Germany after that, and so that was kind of a blow to Hitler's forces. Now, I'm going to talk about next the other big turning point battle, of course, in World War II is the Battle of Stalingrad, which took place between 1942 to 1943. Stalingrad is considered to be the most strategic battle really fought in the whole war, like World War II, of course, on the Eastern Front. If you know about Stalingrad, it is considered to be one of the bloodiest battles fought, not just in World War II, but probably in all of history. I think there's a theory that Stalingrad, the casualties may have been as high as almost 2 million combined on both sides. So it's a lot bloodier than some of the battles that were fought like in World War I that we discussed previously before. Kind of an image of this right here. But the study about Stalingrad, it was actually part of a operation called Operation Case Blue, where I think I show image of this right here, but Stalingrad was part of this operation by Hitler to invade the southwestern part of Russia, which that area was important because of the oil fields that were in southwestern Russia. He also wanted to control like Stalingrad, which was on the Volga River, which leads into the Caspian Sea. And so that was the areas that Hitler went after in this second offensive that happened in 1942 called Case Blue, which ended up failing, if you know about that. Anyway, what happened was Stalingrad became this, it became like an urban battle between both sides because the Germans actually took Stalingrad, but they got encircled by the Soviet forces. And Stalingrad was known for a lot of close quarters combat, or urban type warfare, and also a lot of air raids. Because if you know about the Germans, bombed Stalingrad almost to like nothing, like destroyed all the buildings and all that. And so that's part of why the the casualty rates were so high, of course, in the actual war. What happened was, though, between the winter of 1942 to 43, Stalin's forces counterattacked in what became known as Operation Uranus. They actually encircled the main German army that had taken Stalingrad, which was the German Sixth Army, and they couldn't break out. Supposedly, why this happened was the Germans had these Romanian forces that were kind of, you can see at the top and on the bottom there, were like some of their weak forces that were there, and the Soviets broke through and encircled the German forces there in Stalingrad. And so what ended up happening was the German general that was the head of the Sixth Army, his name was Frederick Paulus. He basically decided to surrender his forces because they couldn't break out and their men were starving and freezing to death. And so Paulus became the only German field marshal to be captured during World War II. And so Stalingrad was a major turning point, in World War II. The Germans never really recover. I think in 1943 they do have one more counterattack you may have heard of, Battle of Kursk, which was called Operation Citadel, but that failed again. And so they were never able to really get back on a track to win on the Eastern Front. And so the Soviets eventually began defeating the Germans in the East, and eventually will drive them back into Germany, is what's going to eventually happen. And so Stalingrad was kind of like the grave of the whole, the Third Reich, the Nazi Germany. It's pretty much going to cause its collapse, of course, later. So anyway, I want to move on also to talk about what happens next. Now, the United States and Britain then get involved in Italy next. We invade there, hop from North Africa into Italy. And this was an idea of Winston Churchill, by the way. Churchill thought that Italy was like the soft underbelly of Nazi Germany. They thought they could invade up through southern Europe that way, I guess up through Bavaria, Austria, and into, Germany. However, it proved to be a lot tougher than they thought, to actually do that. And what happened was when we invade Sicily first, if you know about this, in July of 1943, Sicily fell within a month, like under, I think Montgomery and Patton's forces mostly invade Sicily. And the Italian-German forces that tried to, prevent us from taking Sicily eventually retreat back to the Italian mainland. And so what ends up happening is Mussolini resigns at that point. Kind of show you this right here, but Mussolini resigns as prime minister. The King Victor Emmanuel III then seized control of the actual war at this point. And they actually basically remove all the fascists from the government. So they're actually taken away. And Mussolini's actually in prison at that point. He's put on pretty much house arrest. And But what happened, if you know about it, Hitler, Mussolini was one of his biggest allies and all that. And so if you know what happened, Mussolini then actually saved Mussolini. He had some German commandos, this thing called the Grand Sasso Raid, swooped into Italy, and they basically freed him, and they made him this dictator in northern Italy. Otto Skorzeny, you may have heard of him, who was this SS commando, was famous for saving Mussolini, and they then put him up as a dictator. They had this little state they created that I guess Hitler was behind, called the Italian Social Republic. It was this kind of fascist Italian state in northern Italy between 1943-45. He was put in as a puppet ruler, but the Germans really, if you know about it, took over Italy afterwards. Actually, Italy switched. If you know about this, Italy switched to the Allied side, at this point. But it would eventually end up causing a huge campaign afterwards, which was, dubbed the Italian campaign of 1943-45, which would drag on for 2 years. We thought that, after obviously the Italians switched to the Allied side, that Hitler would just give up on Italy and retreat. He refused to do that. And so one of the things that happened was that the Germans, under this general named Albert Kesselring, who you see on the left there, Kesselring decided to use the terrain of Italy to slow down the Allied advance, up through Europe into Austria and Germany. And so Kesselring, he was actually, believe it or not, he was a Luftwaffe general, like in the German Air Force, but he was actually a pretty good general, believe it or not. And he was known as Smiling Albert because of this famous smile, I guess he's known for. But he helped slow it down. But in a sense, the war would, eventually, move toward the Allied favor. I think the most pivotal battle they talk about in the Italian campaign was the Battle of Monte Cassino, which was fought at the beginning of 1944, from January to May of 1944. I think that and the Battle of Anzio, you may have heard of. Monte Cassino was the bloodiest battle of the Italian campaign, and it involved a lot of multi-nationalities. That was one of the weird things about the Italian campaign, was the fact that you had a lot of different peoples that fought in Italy, because of the fact that the Allies were kind of preparing for D-Day at that point in France, to invade France. Italy was even famous for having like African-American troops, like Buffalo Soldiers, that fought in World War II. And then also Japanese Americans too, as well, fought as well. The Nasi, I think they were called, as well. But yeah, they had like Monte Cassino. I think there was a famous monastery that was at the top. You can see that was destroyed. And the Allies had to bomb it, which angered the Catholic Church, because that was an old abbey, monastery and abbey, I think that was there, but it was totally destroyed in the battle. But of course, later, as the Allies drove up into northern Italy, Mussolini was eventually captured at the end of the war, and they shot him. They hung him by his toes. You can see right there. I think his mistress, they shot her too and killed her as well. So he wouldn't survive the war. Mussolini, he would be, of course, killed. Now, of course, the other thing that happened too, of course, into 1944 is the D-Day invasion. Of course, that's probably one of the most famous things that the United States was associated with in World War II, where the Allies eventually invaded occupied France, which had been held by the Germans for close to about 4 years. And the Allied invasion of occupied France was part of a huge operation they called Operation Overlord, which that was actually what they called later the Battle of Normandy, which was the most pivotal battle, really, to take back France in 1944. This was a plan, by the way, that they'd been working on militarily for months, for a couple years. And I think Stalin had wanted them to open up a new front like this back in 42 or 43 to relieve the Eastern Front in Stalingrad. But it took them, a long time to prepare this whole operation more than anything. D-Day, by the way, involved mostly these powers. The United States put up a majority of the forces, so about almost 2/3. But you can see Britain was involved. Canada put up forces, believe it or not. The Free French and also Free Polish forces also were involved too in World War II. And you can see it took place in June of 1944. There's been a lot of books written, about D-Day. I know Stephen Ambrose, I think, has got the most famous book ever written from Louisiana, D-Day, of course. But yeah, Dwight D. Eisenhower, he, of course, would be the man that would command the Allied Expeditionary Force that would invade France in June of 1944. He was seen as the perfect, general to lead the Allied Expeditionary Force because he was a great leader of men. If you know about that, Eisenhower was later, president of the United States in the 1950s. You can see the amount of forces that they put up. About 160,000 troops landed on a 50-mile front or stretch in northern France along the beaches of Normandy. You can see Eisenhower made the famous comment, "We will accept nothing less than victory." But you can see the amount of forces that were involved. The actual initial invasion is called Operation Neptune. I don't know if you know that. But it was considered the largest amphibious invasion in history total. So over 5,000 ships involved, around 160,000 troops, I think, in the initial invasion. I think 2 million men would eventually, invade into France over time. And then more than 11,000 aircraft were also used as well. Pretty much the Luftwaffe was pretty much almost destroyed by the end of the war. Here's kind of and I did want to mention about, if I could find it, where is it? Right here. But of course, D-Day. D-Day was very famous for this man named Andrew Higgins. I did want to mention him. He's kind of important in why D-Day was successful, not just there, but also all the Pacific battles that were amphibious that were fought too, like in the Pacific Ocean against the Japanese. Andrew Higgins, who was from New Orleans, by the way, was famous. He was a famous boat manufacturer. He was known for building a lot of these amphibious landing craft, which were called LCVP, you may have heard of. And these were originally used, by the way, in Louisiana, like in swamps and marshes and things like that. Probably still used. And they pretty much helped, why the war was won because of him. And I think Hitler remarked that Higgins, he was the new Noah. And so he's something that most people don't talk about much, but he's something that's kind of well known because of that. If you go back up here, you can see the actual plan, I guess, of the invasion route in June of 1944. Most people don't understand this, but the invasion would not have been possible without this operation they talk about called Operation Bodyguard, where the Allies had this deception plan that they created against the Nazis to fool them on the location of the D-Day invasion. They tried to make it so that the Germans would think that the invasion of France, northern France, would come at Calais, which is across from the Strait of Dover, and so they tried to make it seem like it was going to be there. And so the United States created a lot of bogus armies, bogus invasion plots were put forth. They had one called Quicksilver, which was a bogus American army that was put at Calais, which was headed up by George S. Patton. It was known as the First U.S. Army Group. So they tricked them that way by having these fake armies that didn't exist. Also, there was they had also the Fortitude North was another operation, which was a fake invasion of Norway because the Germans were still in Norway by the end of the war. Operation Zeppelin was another was another type of fake invasion too, where they were going to attack somewhere in southern Europe, of course. You can see here, by the way, that's the Normandy landings where the American, British, and Canadian forces came ashore. You can see how the Americans came ashore at Utah and Omaha beaches. And then the British came ashore at Golden Sword. And then also Juneau was where the Canadians landed. They also used airborne divisions as well to basically take important strategic targets or bridges that might be important with the invasion. And so the main target basically of primarily the Battle of Normandy, as it will be, of course, called, by June of 1944, is to capture some of those major cities like Cherbourg, Caen, and so on. And then from there, they were hoping to eventually push to take Paris over time. And I think I've got images showing after they bring all the supplies in. At that point, it's D-Day +1. They start bringing people ashore into northern France. Here's kind of a map of the Battle of Normandy, but Battle of Normandy was a strategic battle of the whole, Western Front in France. The most important battle was the Battle of the Falaise Pocket, or also called Falaise Gap. I think it's called either one. And what happened was the Allied forces from Normandy, the northern part of Normandy on the English Channel, were able to take Caen. And then from there, they began to encircle a lot of the German forces that tried to counterattack because Hitler got caught off guard. Hitler thought that the invasion was going to happen at Calais, and by the time they got reinforcements down there, the Allies were able to push inward. And at the 7th Army, the German 7th Army got almost encircled in that battle. I think they call it Falaise Gap because there was a gap left there by, I think, Polish forces, I think it was, and they were able to escape, some of the German forces. But Normandy is important because Paris will fall within a few weeks after that. But the Battle of Normandy is considered to be one of the bloodiest battles in American history. I think maybe close to 29,000 Americans were actually killed in the Battle of Normandy. So it is up there with the Battle of the Argonne Force. I think those two are considered really the two bloodiest campaigns I know in American history that you have. So yeah, Paris falls in August. I think Hitler wanted to blow up Paris, but a lot of his generals wouldn't do it. And so you can see here the Americans parading, looks like American forces parading through, of course, Paris, as of course, Paris is freed, of course, after that. Now, also, there was this other incident I did want to mention about that happened, by the way. There was an attempt on Hitler's life that occurred in July of 1944, which it's called different names. They call it Operation Valkyrie, I think was one nickname they called it. And apparently there was a ring of officers that were in the German Wehrmacht that wanted to kill off Hitler, like in a coup, and they were going to basically try to take over, they think, the war. That was I think the theory about it. And the Gestapo had a nickname for it. They called it the Schwarzkapelle, which meant Black Orchestra. And they're not sure what the deal was. I think they wanted the Wehrmacht to take control because they thought Hitler had too much power over the military. He was pretty much micromanaging the war at that point. And they thought that's why they were losing. And of course, some claim that maybe they were going to surrender early to the Allies. They're not sure about that for sure. But what they do know is that this man on the right was one of the main conspirators, which was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Stauffenberg was this German war hero that had been wounded in North Africa. I think he had lost his hand, and I think his other hand, he only had a few fingers on it. And Stauffenberg was kind of hired as the one to go and kill Hitler. And if you know about it, at his military headquarters in East Prussia, which was called, I think it was Rastenburg is what was the town. I think it's now in Poland, I want to say now where it is. But it's the Wolf's Lair, of course, is what it was called by Hitler. And anyway, they had 2 bombs in the briefcase, but he was only able to arm like one of the 2 bombs. And the bomb went off. It blew up the actual room they were meeting in, but it failed to kill Hitler. I think here's kind of destruction of the actual room. It blew up. And so it was called the 20 July plot, is what they called it. And the conspirators were all rounded up, including Stauffenberg, and they were executed for it. Rommel was even implicated in it because I think they say he knew about it, and Rommel was forced to commit suicide, is what, of course, happened. So anyway, that's basically the whole story about that. But Hitler kind of came out of it unscathed. He wasn't really wounded much in it and all that. Now I'm going to get in next. I'm going to talk about the end, of course, the end of the whole, Third Reich collapsing, which of course happens, within really a few months, like within less than a year after that. Of course, Nazi Germany is going to collapse pretty quick. They do have this event called the Battle of the Bulge that follows next. If you know much about that, that was considered one of the bloodiest battles that was really fought on the Western Front, especially with the Americans involved. It's called different names, but usually called the Battle of the Bulge or Battle of the Ardennes, I think was sometimes they called it as well, which happened between December 1944 to January of 1945. The Germans also had another name for it. They called it Operation Watch on the Rhine, because of the fact that the Germans were kind of concerned that the Allies were going to cross the Rhine River and then drive their forces into Germany, and they wouldn't be able to stop them. And so the Germans decided to counterattack with this huge winter offensive, which the Germans had really had a winter offensive since, I want to say, Frederick the Great. They had done this since like the 18th century and all that. And they hoped to do like in 1940, they were going to drive their forces through the Ardennes forests like they did before with another, I guess, mechanized tank army. And then they were going to try to split the Allies in half, like the British and the Americans mostly. Because of this map, which is right here, the Germans were hoping to drive on what they call Antwerp, which was a very important port city in Belgium. And then if they could take Antwerp, they could get supplies there or prevent the Allies from getting supplies. Because that was really one of the reasons why, if you know about it, the Allies had driven, they took Paris in 1944. But you can see there, it took them like forever to actually drive into Belgium because of the fact that they couldn't supply their forces and all that. In fact, I think the Allies had to rely on this thing called the Red Ball Express, if you know about that, which mostly had African-American troops that worked with it to supply their forces and all that. But that led to the Battle of the Bulge. What happened was the Germans almost broke through. You can see it formed this huge bulge in the Allied lines right there, which they think the Battle of the Bulge started on December 16th. Total surprise, because people thinking about Christmas and all that coming around the corner. And there was one city that was important called Bastion, which was in southern Belgium, which was kind of a strategic city. They were trying to take that because it was kind of a crossroads town. And the Allied forces, the American forces that were there, which were under the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, they refused to surrender to the German forces. And the general there named General Anthony McAuliffe, you know about this, sent a message to the Germans saying, nuts, that we're not going to surrender. But the Germans couldn't understand what they were talking about. Newts, what's newts? But yeah, they and of course, Patton, they always talk about Patton's forces. Patton's forces, of course, came in. Patton's Third Army really was the key to it, I guess, that helped seal the Battle of the Bulge. And eventually, what's going to happen from there, if you go to, of course, this map here after the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium, then I think starting in March, I want to say 1945, The Allies in the West crossed the Rhine River. Then you can see the Soviet forces. It took them a long time, but eventually they drove through Poland, took Poland back. And then you can see also how the Soviet forces also drove up through southern Eastern Europe, up through like Hungary and Yugoslavia. And so you can see they're starting to drive up into greater Germany at that point. The key thing that really led to the end of the war was the Battle of Berlin. That was really the last major important battle that was really fought in Europe at that point. Which the Battle of Berlin, you can see, took place between April to May of 1945. Part of why that battle took place, there was an offensive that happened at the beginning of 1940 called the Vistula-Oder offensive. I don't know if you know about this, but the Soviets finally crushed the Germans in Poland, and they drove from the Vistula River to the Oder River with, it was like, I think like 300 miles or so in like 3 weeks. They drove the Germans back. And so they're able to drive deeply into German territory. And so that broke the back of pretty much the German forces in the Eastern Front. And eventually the Germans begin surrendering by May 2nd. That they think this happens after Adolf Hitler committed suicide. They think Hitler killed himself on April 30th in his bunker below the Chancellery building, because Hitler had been in his bunker, Chancellor bunker, going back to January because of all the air bombing, because the Allies had been bombing Berlin for months. And so the Soviets at that point occupy the eastern part of Germany, later called East Germany. And then you see, you get the west part of Germany, which Britain, France, and USA, they'll occupy those areas also as well. And so the Germans begin surrendering starting on May 2nd is actually when it is. But the actual official surrender of the Germans don't really take place till May 8th is actually when it is. So I guess when they sign the official surrender documents. And in Europe, they later call that Victory in Europe Day or VE Day overall. And so, yeah, the war in Europe was pretty much over at that point. But we'll talk about, of course, I'll get into the Pacific campaign in a second. But yeah, that's not going to be it. We'll talk about what happens later. Of course, Germany is going to be occupied, after the war. They're going to eventually take it over and divide it up, which will kind of lead to, the Cold War era following afterwards. And then we'll also talk briefly, but they, as they take Germany back and all that and defeat the Axis powers, they also discover, a lot of the war atrocities that were committed, after the war, like the Holocaust and so on. And that was another remnant of course, of the war that was kind of famous. I'll also talk about the casualties of the war, of course, which were pretty steep as well. Now, yeah, you've got also the Pacific campaign. That was something else that continued afterwards, where, the United States had to defeat Japan, that, had taken half of the Pacific at that point because, remember, the U.S. had been badly beaten at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And so that was one aspect of the war that followed that was kind of important. So yeah, the war in the Pacific, also called Pacific War, Pacific Campaign. I think those are the common nicknames that they usually dub it overall. And I'll get into primarily the first thing I guess we'll talk about, which is the Battle of Midway, which you see here, which took place between June 4th to the 7th, 1942. That was considered to be the most strategic battle that was fought in the Pacific, like we saw in the short little video at the beginning. It is considered the turning point battle that really leads to why the United States defeats Japan in the Pacific, and Japan really never really recovered from the Battle of Midway. Midway, if you know much about it, is this atoll of islands that are in the Central Pacific, and Japanese wanted to take Midway to be able to then maybe seize Hawaii and then knock us out of the war. And so our Navy, as you know, the U.S. Navy took on the Japanese Navy, which was outnumbered greatly in the battle. And our dive bombers were kind of critical, about it at Midway, or even though we were outnumbered badly, we were able to eventually put a major toll on their fleet. Eventually at Midway, as they say in that little short video, we would eventually sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers at Midway. And they later dubbed it the so-called Miracle at Midway. I think it's kind of sometimes a nickname they called it because of the fact that we were able to defeat them when decisively it looked like the Japanese had an advantage because they had more aircraft carriers. I think they even had more planes than we did overall. And we were able to sink 4 of the 6 aircraft carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor: Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu, last one that sunk. And so that was something that the Japanese were really never able to recover from because they lost a lot of important pilots that had, were involved, experienced pilots that went back to Pearl Harbor and all that. And they also lost a lot of aircraft carriers that were kind of important too in the war. Here's other images, of course. They lost 4 aircraft carriers. We lost only 1, which the USS Yorktown, you can see there, which is listing and all that. But I want to talk about after Midway. Now, after Midway, the U.S. Eventually went on this new strategy to defeat the Japanese, which was called either island hopping or called leapfrogging. That was a strategy where the U.S. military, using like the Navy, the U.S. Marines, and also our Army, U.S. Army, United States Army, to take back island by island that were kind of considered, important in the Pacific. And so they skipped some islands that were kind of deemed not as important, if you know about that. And so you can see most areas they wanted to take back were the Central Pacific and Southern Pacific, because those are the areas that primarily that the Japanese took. As you can see, they almost at one point took half the Pacific. I think it was even a threat where the Japanese were going to try to take New Guinea and Australia, which Australia was kind of important because Australia was where we get a lot of our supplies to supply our forces in the Pacific and all that. And these were the 2 military men that were kind of important in the Pacific. On the left, you had Nimitz, Chester Nimitz. He was the head of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. He wanted to attack through the Central Pacific. That was the goal of Nimitz, using like the Marines and Army. And he wanted to try to take islands like the Mariana Islands back, which are important later, because then they would start being able to bomb Japan by air strategically. So have that idea. And then also Douglas MacArthur, he preferred to attack the Southern Pacific because he thought the Philippines were kind of important. He also, was using Australia as a base to attack there. And so they both had these different strategies that they wanted to take. And they're both, I know MacArthur was kind of controversial. I think some people called him the American Caesar, if you know about that. And was considered one of the greatest generals in World War II, up there with like Patton, etc. They have battles later that are important in the Pacific. Of course, our first major battle that's really considered important was the Battle of Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was an important battle because of the Solomon Islands. The Japanese had taken over them, and they were building like air bases there to attack like New Guinea in Australia. And so between 1942 to 43, mostly U.S. Marines were brought in to take back Guadalcanal and to re-seize, part of the Solomon Islands, which was a very bloody conflict, by the way, which lasted like 6 months. It was also pretty bad naval battles were fought too in the Solomon Islands. And Guadalcanal is important because it's considered the first major, U.S. Marine battle in World War II. It's, made kind of famous later in the U.S. Marine Corps hymn, kind of like Iwo Jima and all that. the it was awful because of the jungle warfare that was fought there. That between, and of course, the Japanese were tenacious. They had 24,000 out of 36,000 men would eventually get killed fighting, of course. And I think we suffered something like 15,000 killed and wounded. And so you can see the kind of terrain they had to fight in the Pacific, kind of jungle type warfare overall. Here's kind of an image, of course, of Guadalcanal and the taking of it, but they mostly wanted it because of like the airfields that were there on the actual island itself. Other islands that were kind of important too. The Allies, Americans also took back the Gilbert Islands. That was kind of considered strategic as well, where Tarawa is. That was considered kind of probably the bloodiest battle that was fought in 1943 in the Pacific, where U.S. Marines were involved in that as well. So you have that battle. And then the other big battle that was fought too was the battles for like Guam and all that, which they called it Operation Forager. That happened between June of 1944. Americans, Marines, and U.S. Army took what were basically the Mariana Islands, which were Guam, Tin Yen, Saipan. Those were vital because they could then build air bases there where they could then use those to strike Japan from the air. And so we began to build air bases. You see there, like with these B29 super fortresses, which were used at the end of the war, as you know. And it's also going to be like on Tin Yen, it's also going to be where they'll also bring like the atomic bomb as well, which will be also dropped on Japan later as well. So that was considered to be kind of vital as well. From there, we then tried to take back the Philippines next. The Battle of Philippines, of course, was kind of considered somewhat important as well, especially in the Southern Pacific. And that did involve a famous battle I did want to mention about, which was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which happened in October of 1944. Leyte Gulf was considered to be the greatest naval battle in history. It was the largest ever in history, which involved something like 300 something U.S. naval vessels were involved. And I think the Japanese had about 60 naval vessels. So we had almost 5 times what they had. And the Battle of Leyte Gulf was actually 4 naval battles that were fought in a period of 4 days off the coast of the Philippines. And we wiped out the majority of what was left of the Japanese Navy at that point. So that was one of the last, I think, important. There's 4 or 5 important, I think, carrier battles, I think, that were fought in World War II. And that's considered, I think, one of the last ones that's well known. But yeah, it's considered one of the largest naval battles that was ever fought, of course, in the war. There's MacArthur. The Philippines was a bloody conflict, which would go on for months. But yeah, MacArthur had made this promise, I think, years before, after the Philippines fell, that I would return, I think is what he would say. And so there's an image of MacArthur wading ashore in the Philippines and all that. But let me move on to talk about more important battles that were more strategic, really, in the war. They do have the Battle of Iwo Jima that was fought in 1945, between February and March of 1945, which you can see there. You can see it was part of an operation which mostly involved Marines. U.S. Marines were involved, called Operation Detachment. They do consider to be the Battle of Iwo Jima to be the greatest, by the way, battle in Marine Corps history. It's not just in their Marine Corps hymn, but it is kind of known for them storming Iwo Jima, and of course the famous flag raising on Iwo Jima. That's well known, of course, today. Why did the Americans want Iwo Jima? Iwo Jima was kind of they wanted to take it because of the fact that it was kind of seen as an important island that was kind of east of Japan, that they could use as a kind of a close support bomber base. So like any kind of bombers that were damaged, they could land on the island, as emergency. And so that's mostly why they tried to take it. Was the whole point of it. Of course, there's a lot of images of Iwo Jima, but the casualties were pretty high. The Japanese, by the way, which had about 19,000 men or something like that on the island, refused to surrender. So they had pretty much fought to the death. The Japanese believed in the Code of Bushido, if you know about that, which is kind of like a samurai code belief that you shouldn't surrender. You should either fight to the death or commit suicide. And so I think only 200 men of the Japanese actually survived that surrendered, or they captured or whatever. But you can see the casualty rate on the American side was pretty high, about 26,000, of course, overall. If you know about Iwo Jima, it is very famous for the raising the flag on Iwo Jima, the American flag, which you see right here. Here's, of course, a better image of it right there. And it was a famous picture, by the way, that was taken by Joe Rosenthal, who was a photographer, I believe. I want to say I thought it was for the AP or something like that. But was taken on Mount Suribachi, which is like this dormant volcano that's on the island. And 6 men, by the way, were involved in the American flag raising on Mount Suribachi, which if you want the 6 men, here they are: Harlan Block, Harold Keller, Ira Hayes, Harold Schultz, Franklin Sousley, and Michael, of course, Strank. They were the 3 men, of course, that raised the actual flag on Iwo Jima. Of the 6 men, 3 would get killed, by the way, in the battles. Only 3 of the men survived. Ira Hayes, the 3rd one there, of course, was a famous Native American Indian who actually helped raise the flag. So he kind of became well known afterwards. So that became a very iconic image, probably one of the most famous pictures ever taken, probably in World War II. Of course, in Washington, D.C., they have a monument that looks just like it. Of course, the other big battle they fought, too, was the Battle of Okinawa, fought later by April to June of 1945. This particular battle was part of an operation, I think it was called Operation Iceberg, it was called. And the idea was to seize Okinawa, which was one of Japan's home islands. They were going to try to take that island and then use it as a springboard to invade Japan itself, which they later called Operation Downfall, which never happened. You know about that. And so this battle involved American, U.S. forces, mostly like Marine and Army forces. And it was considered one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific. They consider Okinawa to be the most bloodiest, largest amphibious operation, of course, in the Pacific that was ever fought. And the Japanese, just like on Iwo Jima, refused to surrender. They fought tenaciously because it's near Japan and all that. You can see our casualties are pretty high. Like the U.S. casualties are somewhere between 60 to 70,000 men that were killed or wounded or exhausted from the battle. It was 13,000 killed. So it's the bloodiest battle we fought in the Pacific. The Japanese, I think they had like 120,000 men. 110,000 were killed in the battle. A lot of them refused to surrender. They did like bonsai charges. They just mow them down, machine guns or whatever. Or they had to go with like the hidden caves and they had to use like flamethrowers to burn them out and all that. And so, Okinawa is considered to be a really bloody conflict. So he has an image right there, of course, Okinawa. Battles like Okinawa and all that, they started to see also problems with kamikaze attacks as well. The Japanese got kind of desperate, as you know, at the end of the war. And so they started using suicide planes, filled with bombs in them to basically take out U.S. ships that were part of these invasions. And so they were known as kamikaze, which was a Japanese word meaning divine wind. They thought this might be a miracle that might change the war around basically. And so a lot of these suicide pilots, would attempt to attack the Americans. And they think that the kamikaze attacks themselves did a lot of damage. If you look at the statistics here between 1944-45, they think as far back as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese started doing kamikaze attacks, but they sank or damaged as many as 34 ships were sunk by kamikaze, and you can see 368 were damaged at one point. Bunker Hill, which was an aircraft carrier, I think at Okinawa, was badly damaged, you can see, by a kamikaze attack. And they think it may have killed or wounded up to 9,000 sailors. You go like the USS Kidd, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, it was hit by a kamikaze, if you know about that, and actually taken out of the actual, I think it was at Okinawa it got hit, I believe, and was taken out of action because of that one point. That's it's kind of famous, with of course, World War II, the kamikaze attacks. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about, too, is the United States also helped to develop the atomic bomb. They think that was another major thing that was a turning point in World War II as well. They have the so-called Manhattan Project you may have heard about, which was very, very secretive, where the U.S. Army developed this super bomb or super weapon to use to knock out either Germany or Japan in the war. And I think both sides, if you read about, the Manhattan Project, both sides had been working on an atomic bomb. Germans, they think, were working on one, I know, I think it's Norway. They tried to work on one. Japanese, you believe it or not, had been working on a similar bomb as well, but we were able to eventually develop it before anybody else did. They do think that the Manhattan Project was a project that FDR helped develop, but they think it was the brainchild of actually Albert Einstein, who had escaped Nazi Germany, for being Jewish. But the atomic bomb itself, here I'll kind of show you right there. It was actually headed up by this famous American general named Leslie Groves. He's the one that actually ran the actual Manhattan Project. He was part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They're the ones that actually built the atomic bombs, by the way. And Groves, if you know much about him, was very famous for, before the Manhattan Project, of building the Pentagon building, like the U.S. Defense Department building, which is in Washington. He's one actually built and designed it, like in that Pentagon shape. And if you know about the Pentagon, it's the largest office building in the world that was ever constructed. And so he's one that designed it. And then after that, they gave him this job to basically run the Manhattan Project. And so he started hiring all these scientists to come in to basically run it, which some were foreign. Some were from like Europe, but they hired Enrique Fermi and others that were kind of involved. I think they had, who was that Hungarian one? Edward Teller, who was Hungarian. Yeah, he was involved. But J. Robert Oppenheimer was really the most famous physicist that was involved. He was an American physicist that was a professor in California. And he's the one that helped design the atomic bombs at Los Alamos, which was one of the main headquarters of where they built the Manhattan Project bombs. Although it was called Manhattan Project, if you know about this, because initially some of the experiments were done at Columbia University in Manhattan, New York. That's the whole term of where the name came from. But Oppenheimer was later given a nickname. He was called the father of the atomic bomb, which is kind of a dreaded nickname if you know about that. But a lot of people called him Oppie, was this little nickname. So he was the guy who was behind it. They built different bombs. They had this one they called the Gadget they built first at Los Alamos. That's the one that they would detonate first. They would blow that one up in July of 1945. They exploded the first bomb at Alamogordo, New Mexico. And so they realized at that point that they had this super bomb that they could use. But by that time, Germany had surrendered, so they dropped it on Japan instead. Is what happened. But those are the different bombs that they actually designed. There were two bombs. They had Little Boy, which was a uranium bomb, and then Fat Man was a plutonium bomb. I think that's right. These are these fission type bombs that they constructed that they would eventually drop on Japan. And I think the first bomb I know, which is Little Boy, was shipped by the cruiser, the USS Indianapolis. If you know the story about this, shipped across the Pacific to Tianjin. And of course, the ship was later sunk. You know about that, but it was shipped to Tianjin, and they would eventually drop it from there. But the actual plane that was involved in the first dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan, which is Little Boy, was this plane that was called the Enola Gay. If you know much about that plane, it is considered to be the first. It was really the most famous bomb, the most famous plane really in World War II. That was, of course, well known. So it's the one that would eventually drop the first atomic bomb on Japan on August 6, 1945. Of course, piloted by Captain Paul Tibbets. Right there, we can see that. That's, of course, the famous Enola Gay, which is, by the way, named after his mother. That's where the name came from, if you wonder. And you can see here's the actual picture from the actual dropping of the bomb. I do have a short video I'll kind of show you, kind of to share with you about the dropping of the atomic bomb. But here's kind of like what it looked like when it blew up and all that, these atomic bombs.
First in a test in the United States New Mexico desert, then 5,000 miles away at Hiroshima, and then again at Nagasaki, came the world-shaking explosions of the atomic bomb.
Latest reports from the Japanese say that 126,000 died as the result of the damage done by the single bomb that blasted the city. With the help of gauze masks, a few citizens seemed able to exist among the wastelands. Although the end of Japan's aggression was in sight before atomic bombings, it was this terrific force that finally signed her death warrant.
Mankind.
The end of the greatest of wars was the more dramatic because of suspense. Great crowds waiting, as here in New York. In the early hours of the morning, shortly before 2 a.m., the Jap radio announced that the final surrender message was being sent. There was all-day jubilation all around the world.
So a short little video there showing the atomic bomb and, of course, dropping on Japan. There were actually two bombs dropped, of course, on Japan. The other one they had also as well was Fat Man. That one was dropped, of course, also a few days later, August the 9th, 1945. There was another B-29 named Boxcar, you may have heard of, that dropped that one on Nagasaki, killing close to 80,000 or more people. So, yeah, combined, they think that both these atomic weapons killed like 200,000 or more. But the Americans, you know, if you know about this, you know, pretty much bombed Japan from the air. I think we killed more people than the atomic bombs did. But the bombing of Japan really played kind of a major role in why Japan eventually surrendered. Also, the Soviets, if you know about this, August 9th declared war on Japan too. And so Japan realized that I guess if they didn't surrender, they might lose territory and all that. And so August 15th, 1945, that's the date, of course, when, you know, Japan would start surrendering to the Allies throughout not just in Japan or Pacific, but also in Asia as well. And so that was known as Victory over Japan Day or VJ Day. But you can see what images, like right here, but you can see how damaging these atomic bombs were that were dropped on like Hiroshima, right there. You can see it destroyed most of a lot of the main buildings, well, a lot of the smaller buildings anyway. But I guess if it was something made of cement, whatever, built real well, it survived. So actually destroyed several square miles of Hiroshima in the actual bombing. Here, of course, is the image of the Japanese officially surrender. The Japanese officially surrender on September 2nd, 1945 in Tokyo Bay aboard this battleship you may have heard of called USS Missouri. That's the official, date when the World War II actually comes to an end at that point. So basically 50, 60 million people they think were killed in World War II overall. I think I do have an image showing the amount of deaths in World War II, but it was quite heavy. Like you can see the amount of deaths. Soviet Union probably suffered the most overall, followed by China and Poland. Those three had the most deaths, believe it or not, in World War II, and also Germany. Germany on the Axis side, of course, had the most, along with Japan as well. So 50, 60 million. You can see civilians were pretty high in the war as well. Which was more than half. So pretty bloody how things were, of course, in World War II. Now, I did want to talk about, of course, something that's well known in World War II. The Wannsee Conference, if you know about it, is something that really in the Holocaust. The Holocaust is something that the Allies discovered, if you know much about, after World War II in Europe. We also found atrocities that the Japanese committed as well in the Pacific. The Holocaust or show up, that was something that they think was part of a mass German plan to exterminate people like the Jews and other groups in Europe. The Wannsee Conference was something that was started back in January of 1942. It was part of this conference to decide the final solution to the Jewish question, like what to do with the Jews and all that. They do think that the two big men that were behind that were Hermann Goering, who got in trouble for that after the war. Also, Reinhard Heydrich, you see on the right with Hermann Goering, who was part of the SS. He was actually with the SD, Seyker-Heitstenz, so it was part of the SS. They think Hitler was probably involved somehow, but they're not sure how, because there's never been any written proof that Hitler knew about the Holocaust. But they think it was maybe verbal. The plan, of course, was to deport people. They used like the railroads to deport people to mostly Poland or Germany, where they were put in concentration camps. And then they also used extermination camps to eliminate anybody that they thought was not useful. It's estimated, they're not really sure exactly what it was. But they estimated that close to 11 million people were killed under the Nazis, which included Poles, Soviet civilians, a lot of POWs of the Soviets, maybe 3 million died under the Germans. A lot of the Roma or Gypsies were killed. Handicapped, gay people were exterminated. A lot of priests that were against the Germans were killed as well. And then they think somewhere between 5 to 6 million Jews may have also been killed as well. Of course, in Poland, they were put in ghettos, and then eventually they were shipped to concentration camps as well. Auschwitz-Birkenau, of course, is one of several of these camps that were established in Poland. These are really the most famous that did have death camps. Like Auschwitz-Birkenau, of course, the most famous that may have had the most that were killed. Treblinka, Sobibor, Matadek, Belzec, Chelmno, those were also very famous as well. That's the actual railway as it goes into Auschwitz that you're looking at. They think at Auschwitz, when they disembarked, that they would separate people from those that they could use for labor, and then those that they thought were useless, like too young or too old, they would have them exterminated, like gas them and kill them. And so they think that was the method, which I think they think that I believe it was Adolf Eichmann they accused later of kind of helping to orchestrate the deporting of Jews all over Europe and all that later. That's the famous sign that goes into the actual concentration camp aspect of Auschwitz, which it says above the gate, "Work will set you free." There's some of the Auschwitz dead. Of course, some were buried in mass graves, but the Germans realized they had to burn the bodies to, keep it secret. So they used cremation to basically burn all the bodies in crematoriums, which I think the crematoriums were destroyed by the Germans later. They had these huge crematoriums that they built to actually burn the bodies. Later, they had the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials were a series of war crime trials. They were held in Germany between 1945 to 46 in Munich, actually in Nuremberg and Bavaria. And a lot of the top leadership of the Nazis were put on trial. The ones that were the most famous they put on trial were Hermann Goering, Karl Dönitz, who was head of the German Navy. He was the Führer at the end after, I think, Hitler killed himself. Rudolf Hess was this deputy Führer of Hitler that fled Germany during the war. They actually put him on trial as well. Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl were the head of the German Wehrmacht. They were the chiefs of staff, or the chief generals that were the head of those armies. They were later executed after the war. Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was the foreign minister, remember him? He was the one that created the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement. He was executed too after the war. And Albert Speer, he was this minister that was under Hitler that ran all the war munitions. He was actually also an architect of Hitler. And Albert Speer got in trouble for using slave labor. So did Goering. And Speer was the one that was the only Nazi, I think, at the Nuremberg trials that said that he was sorry. The Nazis said sorry, I think is what they called him, or something like that. There's, of course, Goering, but Hermann Goering was the most famous Nazi at the Nuremberg trials, but he later avoided the noose by taking cyanide and killing himself. In Japan, they had something similar, the Tokyo War Crimes trial, where they were put on trial as well, a bunch of Japanese that were involved in war crimes. And the most famous was Hideki Tojo, who you see on the far left there. He was later found guilty and executed as well. This all happened under the fact that the Americans occupied Japan after the war. You know about that under Douglas MacArthur. And so a lot of Japanese were put on also the same kind of thing there as well. So yeah, like I said, the aftermath of the war was, like I said, pretty bloody. We have all these people that were, killed in the war. World War II is the bloodiest conflict really in human history. It is going to cause another conflict later, which I'll have some recorded lectures on that as well that I've got. You can kind of watch this week. But the Cold War era, that's something that's going to happen because of World War II. You've got this deal where they think that it caused a lot of animosity between the Soviet Union and the United States. There's this tensions that were created after the war where you've got these only two major superpowers left because all those other ones have been taken out, along with nuclear weapons. You add to that as well. And so you've got that leads to that standoff between East and West. And also communism spreads to Asia. Like China becomes communist. North Korea's communist, Vietnam's communist. So you got the domino theory, where communism is spreading all over the world. So yeah, I'll have some lectures on that. I'll have that'll be like recorded, which will be on the Cold War era. I'll have like a bonus quiz I'm going to have on that, extra credit for the semester. You can earn, I think, up to 40 bonus points on that. But our final exam is going to be on World War I, the rise of fascism in World War II. That's pretty much it for that. But yeah, these are the assignments that I've got out right now. I think the British quiz is still open. If you haven't taken that, I think I still got it open for now. But those are your major assignments that you have left to really wrap up the semester. Second exam, you should be trying to get that wrapped up this week, out the way before finals next week. The World War I quiz is something you'll need to work on too. Get that out the way. Third vocab. There's not going to be a final vocab. There's only 3. Third vocab due this week. Final exam, of course, due next Friday. I think I'll probably give you to like noon next Friday. Bonus quiz also due as well next week, next Friday. And then the book report is also due, of course, in week 8 as well. So it's kind of reminding you about that. So that's really it for the semester. I don't think we have any other questions out there right there. But yeah, this has been an enjoyable semester. Hope everybody had a great summer overall at BRCC. If you have any comments, questions about this lecture or previous lectures, you can leave me comments on my channel. There's also discussion questions I've been putting up too, if you want to put them in there, but you can just put them on YouTube if you've got a comment or question about one of the lectures, more or less. So that's it for the summer. I might have a History 1113 if you haven't taken that, maybe in the fall. That might be available. I'm not sure. It might be online. I'm not sure or not, but that's pretty much it overall. So y'all take care. Have a great rest of the summer, by the way. Take it easy. And of course, make sure y'all complete your assignments, of course, at the end, because week 8 finals, of course, coming up next week. But I'll send out a lot of emails like I usually do, announcements about the end of the semester. I'll also talk about exemptions, like who's going to be exempt and all that later. So y'all take care and have a great one.